Good morning. I'm now going to call to order this meeting of the Minneapolis Audit Committee for Tuesday, January 10th. Sorry the delay. We just had a lot of traffic issues in this snowy morning. My name is Lene Palmasano, and I'm the chair of this committee. With me at the dais are the following committee members. We have Councilmember John Quincy, we have Park Commissioner Liz Walensky, Vice Chair Scott Neal, and myself. So please let the record reflect that we have a quorum. Oh, and we also have David Fisher here approaching the dais. Colleagues, on our agenda today, there are several new reports from our Department of Internal Audit, as well as some updates regarding changes in committee membership. One slight change on the agenda, I'd like to propose we hear item number 8 directly after item number 6, leaving item 7, this next year's audit plan, for the very end. It just seems a more logical way to go through our business this morning. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda as amended?
So moved.
Seconded? Been moved and seconded to adopt the agenda. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and the agenda is adopted. First, we need to accept the meetings from our last meeting, which was back on September 20th. Actually, it was in November. I'll move adoption of those minutes. So all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Yep, an abstention from Commissioner Walensky. The ayes have it, and the minutes are adopted. A few notes on the makeup of this committee. Commissioner Walensky has recently been appointed by the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board to serve on our audit committee. So we thank Commissioner Tabb for her service, and we welcome Commissioner Walensky. Thank you for joining us. Item number 3 on our agenda today is regarding our esteemed colleague and Vice Chair Scott Neal. His term on our committee had come to an end, but he's graciously volunteered to serve a second term. So before you is a letter I've written as chair of this committee to the council urging that the body approve his appointment. I expect all of my colleagues on this committee will enthusiastically support his nomination. May I have a motion to forward Scott Neal's nomination to the council for their consideration? Thank you. Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and Mr. Neal, you'll be forwarded to City Council for recommendation. Thank you. Before us now, we have the 2016 annual report from the Department of Internal Audit. So I'm pleased by the work the department did this past year. And here to present that work is our Director of Internal Audit, Will Tetzel. Mr. Tetzel?
Good morning, Madam Chair. My name is Will Tetzel. I'm the City Auditor. And the first item on our agenda is to walk through the 2016 Internal Audit Annual Report. You received this earlier, so I'll just go through some highlights. In 2016, which I feel like we had a relatively successful year, we completed 10 projects. 7 of those were audits, and 3 of those were consultations, as you can see listed here below. As you'll remember, audits have findings, and each finding can have many recommendations within it. So rather than tracking the amount of findings in an audit, we track the recommendations, because we give departments credit when they close a recommendation rather than the whole finding. There might be several components of a finding. Part of them might be software updates or personnel that they need to hire. But other portions of that are things that they can tackle easier, so we'd rather give them credit for doing some of that work and progress on that, rather than holding them hostage to all of those components of that finding until everything is completed. So when we talk about remediation efforts, we're really talking about the subcomponents of findings there. We had 49 of them from our 2016 projects, and 98% agreement with management. There was one recommendation that we had, if you'll remember, last January. It was related to HRIS access. So when people leave the city, they remain to have access to their personal information in PeopleSoft HR for 30 days, or that's the intent. One of our recommendations was just to not provide that level of access and to instead send them their pay stubs and information that they need, but HR wasn't ready to commit to that. There were other pieces of that finding and recommendations that mitigate that risk, so the residual there is pretty low. This year we closed 4 recommendation remediations, which was a little bit fewer than we thought we would close based on people's projected schedules, but some of those are due to things that need to happen more administratively. And so we're not off track, but we thought we'd get a little bit more done. Based on the activity this year, we feel like we're well positioned and people are taking findings seriously and the remediation effort seriously. Follow-up will continue to become a larger and larger portion of our meetings and probably a more important discussion as we see how some of these key findings are managed, remediated. A lot of times in the past, what we've seen in our experiences in internal audit is people change their mind about what they decided to do a while back and they do something different. And so we need to discuss with them and rationalize, what does that still make sense? Does it still manage that risk appropriately? What residuals left? And so we'll have some more in-depth conversations about those, which I think will be somewhat interesting, that we haven't had yet. We've sort of built up this bank of outstanding recommendations and remediation plans, and those will start to get closed out. And so we'll hear more and more about that in meetings to come. We do our best to send out through the audit chair's office surveys on our audit work after the reports are published to collect some information on audit planning, quality of the reporting, timing, communication, and the recommendations. And we get those back, average the scores out per project, and then average those out across the board. And so this is just a summary of the scores that we got for last year. I think they're in a pretty good spot, 87% satisfaction. The way that the survey is structured doesn't allow our customers to penalize us because they're unhappy that they were audited. There is a comment box in there, and I think if there's significant information in that comment box, we're happy to share that with you. But we tried to make it very neutral, so it was somewhat factual. And did we follow this process? Did we keep them informed? Did we keep them up to date? Were we reasonable? Were we rational? Things like that. I think that's a good measure of how well we're doing. Being audited is uncomfortable, and so we don't expect people to be really excited about the process all the time. And that's a brief summary of the 2016 annual report. There's a little bit more in the report around our vision and mission. That really hasn't changed. But do we have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Tetzel. Are there any questions from the committee? Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize for being late this morning. Mr. Tetzel, I'm interested. There's a section in the annual report on professional development and gives an indication that you do continuing education with staff. I'm just wondering if you could briefly describe what that professional development might be.
Sure, Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher. We are, because we need to stay appraised of the goings on in an enterprise with 20 some different departments, it's important for us to stay educated either on discrete topics or emerging trends in audit-related fields all the time. So we don't have a formal goal for continuing professional education credits, but I think as we move on in the future, we might have something like that. Right now, I think all 3 of the full-time staff in the department are working on a certification. So usually those are well aligned to us understanding, what our jobs are, or learning more and becoming subject matter experts in certain fields. Otherwise, the local IIA chapter, Institute of Internal Auditors, does a fair amount of trainings here in the Twin Cities, and we try to attend those. They do roundtable sessions for anyone in internal auditing. They also have ones for chief executive auditors, specifically more around leadership and developing audit functions and running audit functions. So we try to stay appraised with those. And we also go to the ones where we've done it for so long, but you sometimes take it for granted. All three of us went to a root cause analysis training late last year that the IA put on, and good refresher on making sure that we're doing things right and getting any new ideas we can out there. So we do have a training budget, and we use it, and we try to use it wisely.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Neal.
Mr. Tetzel, if we go back to the first page of the report where you're outlining the number of projects that you completed for the year, could you give us a sense of was that your entire work plan for the year? Was it most of it? I'm just want to get a sense for how your projections were for what you were able to complete compared to what we sort of planned for you to complete in a particular year.
Madam Chair, Mr. Neal, I will do that for you. So last year we had, I think, 14 projects on the plan, and I don't have a slide for this, but I can put it up there for you guys. I have a printout of last year's audit plan. Let's see if this shows up. Oh, maybe not the whole thing. There are 5 projects that were on last year's plan, and we can just talk about them now. So we had one on civil rights contract compliance. That project is probably deferred in the long term. The city coordinator's office did a large body of work around supplier diversity, and that work really got to a lot of the risk that we were thinking about for this audit. So that residual that was left wasn't worth us going in and doing a full-blown project for. Further down here, we had an audit for off-street parking contract. That's on the audit plan for 17. That one was deferred because we increased the scope of the procure to pay audit, and since this one's really large and it was the first year of that contract, it made sense to move that one. That seemed appropriate, and we needed to flex a little bit. This third one down here was the police body camera pre-requirement review. That was deferred because we ran out of IT audit funding, so that's on the docket for this year. And really that's to help us get ready for the state's requirements of the independent audit of body camera data. Enterprise land management system implementation, we just had 40 hours on that one, but we weren't engaged by the business. It was really them asking for help, but they didn't end up coming to us for any help, so that one didn't happen. And then the last one, police records management system implementation. This has been on the plan for this. 2016 would be year 2, 2017 would be year 3. They asked for help from a consultative perspective on the implementation of their records management system. This year, they're finally getting around to having that vendor in place and starting some of the work. So it makes sense for us to now get engaged, where before there really wasn't enough for us to really do. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I've been pleased with how we, something different that we do now with audit is we're constantly looking at the priorities. So there are new priorities that come in, perhaps not when we adopt the year's audit plan, but they are able to then be prioritized and get done that year. We have a timing component of our priorities, so it's not locked. So thank you for that. Any other questions from committee? Great. May I have a motion to receive this 2016 annual report? Moved and then seconded by Commissioner Walensky. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. Now to our first of the 2 reports we're hearing for the first time today. We have the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board Worker Safety Audit Report. Here to present is Kirill Vasiliev. Thank you, Mr. Vasiliev. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, Audit Committee, my name is Kirill Vasiliev, and I am a Senior Internal Auditor in the Internal Audit Department. I'm presenting the audit of the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board's Worker Safety Program. This audit was identified in the 2016 annual audit plan. It came up in the annual risk assessment presented by Park Board Management as one of its high-risk priorities. The criteria for the audit focused on Minnesota OSHA's statutes, rules, and guidelines. Some of the key components were the comprehensive workplace accident and injury reduction program statutes, the AWARE program, employee right to know statutes, which require employers to identify hazardous substances and share that information with their employees, and safety committee statutes and rules, which govern how a labor management group that supports the safety program is set up and needs to be in place. There was prior work around safety at the park board. In 2012, there was a report produced by an efficiency expert identifying some safety issues that the park board had been working to address. And there was also a dedicated employee to safety since 2014. So our audit period focused on the 2015-2016 timeframe. To identify our objectives, we did background research and spoke with park board management. We ended up with basically kind of two key areas. The first was how the established safety program complied with Minnesota's rules, regulations, and guidelines. So looking how the program was designed and whether there was a mismatch to the requirements or to best practices. And second was looking at how that program was actually implemented in certain high-risk areas as identified in background research and discussion with management. For the scope, we pretty much covered all aspects of a safety program. For interviews and walkthroughs, we focused on those high-risk areas. And this audit had 10 findings, which normally we group into smaller number of findings with some subparts, but in this case, it made sense to present them all individually as standalone. And throughout the findings, there'll be the same two themes of there might have been an issue with how something was designed versus the criteria that we were using, or there might have been an okay design, but the way it was actually implemented and put in place and functioning wasn't really working well. And the findings are presented basically in order of the riskiest or highest priority. Our first finding is on hazard identification, assessment, and control. Key goal of a safety program is to keep employees safe and to do so by identifying what could cause harm, the different hazards, assessing how best to approach those hazards, and finally controlling those hazards in line with how the assessment was done. The AWARE program requirements state that this process needs to be established in writing, and the park board did establish a job hazard analysis approach to identifying hazards, assessing those hazards, and controlling them. In our review, we saw that the job hazard analyses were last performed between 2001 and 2004, so they were not current, where normally they'd be at least updated anytime a process changed or looked at when a process changed, and generally should be looked at every year or so. We also, in our interviews, noted that almost all staff didn't know that job hazards were out there, so they were not actually being integrated into the safety program. They just were kind of done many years ago and available but not being used. Second finding is on the safety committee. Safety committee, labor management safety committee, is a requirement under a state statute. It basically provides for a group that has oversight and advisory role to a safety program, and it obtains and reviews program information and provides reports and recommendations to the employer as to how well the safety program is functioning. We observed that the Park Board Safety Committee was last active in 2012. There has been progress since 2012 towards reestablishing a safety committee, and I believe the first meeting of the current committee is going to be happening this month. But in the intervening 4 years, the duties of the safety committee were not being carried out by any kind of labor management group. Our third finding is on inspections. Inspections are an important approach to making sure that equipment is functioning properly and safely, and also helps identify hazards that might be in the workplace and to help enforce policies, because when you know there's going to be inspections, you're more likely to implement those things which maybe you otherwise don't have a reason to put in place that take a little bit of additional time. The park board policies did have a periodic safety inspection program identified. When we looked at that in a little bit more detail, we saw it didn't really specify what an inspection should cover, just said that safety inspections should occur. So there was a bit of a design question there. When we were in the field and when we spoke to park board management, we also saw that there were no safety inspections going on. So the program was also not implemented. During our field reviews, we did also see a number of things that an safety inspection program should address or should catch, including some out-of-date or missing inspection stickers or tags on fire extinguishers, on fire alarm testing. We saw some potential hazards out there, including blocked eye wash stations and equipment and desks set up too close to electrical equipment right next to it instead of allowing for a 3-foot clearance. And we flagged a few other areas for improvement during these walkthroughs that are listed in the report. For inspections, there's also some potential synergy with job hazard assessments, where an inspection can identify whether the hazards were all captured in an assessment, and then the job hazard assessment can help identify what sorts of things need to be looked at or can be looked at when an inspection occurs. So implementing this finding can be connected with how job hazard analysis are getting put into place. Our fourth finding is on goals, objectives, and safety program review. Minnesota statute requires that the AWARE program be reviewed annually and also requires specific documentation to be maintained. We did not get the specific documentation that is expected by Minnesota statute. And we also noted that the terms of what a review consists of was not defined within the program. So when we were trying to see whether the review followed the recommended guidelines for what a review should have, we just didn't see that information. We were not provided that. We also looked at some of the key recommended elements of a review, which were verifying that your goals and objectives are being met or you're advancing towards those goals and objectives, and noted that the objectives in the program were based on metrics that weren't being tracked. So even if a review was conducted, it would be very difficult to say whether or not the program was achieving the objectives that were set out within it. Our fifth finding is on incident investigations. Investigations are very important to understanding what happened during injury or during a near miss, and figure out how to prevent it from happening again. We sampled the injury reports that the park board reported to OSHA and reviewed the supporting documentation, and we had 3 observations. The first was the kind of documents that were maintained to support the investigations was limited. There was enough information to see what happened and what the approach was to address the investigation. But there wasn't really documentation showing how the investigation was conducted. So a lot of the recommended steps of an investigation, we couldn't verify that whether they were being conducted. For example, whether it was being done by a group, whether there were witness interviews, whether there was an on-site examination. That was just not part of the documentation. We also noted that the documents that were maintained were not consistently filled out. There were sections that consisted of checklists leading one to identify a root cause and flag a potential corrective action that were not consistently filled out. And finally, we noted that there was no tracking of whether the remediation or the corrective action decided as a result of the investigation actually occurred. So the documents kind of stopped with, here's what we should do to prevent this from happening again, but there's no follow-up system or verification process to ensure that that was happening. Our next finding is on roles and responsibilities. Clearly assigning roles and responsibilities helps to clearly apportion duties. It helps to better enforce the kinds of expectations and drive the safety program. From our review, we noted the safety program roles and responsibilities did not cover did not list the responsibility for compliance, so there wasn't a specific responsibility for knowing what the statutes and rules and regulations were that the park board needed to comply with. And so there was no one responsible for ensuring and tracking how they were complying with those. So it's a question of it being difficult to comply with the rules and regulations that are out there if nobody's actively keeping tabs on what you need to comply with. We also noted that the roles and responsibilities in the safety program documents weren't reflective of the current organizational structure. So it was just a little bit out of date in terms of what was actually going on the ground versus what was written. Our other observation here was that some of the safety elements in policies and programs did not specifically identify who was to be in charge of those elements. For example, the inspection program mentioned before just stated that an safety inspection program will be instituted or safety inspections will be done without flagging who's going to be doing them or how or any of that information. Our seventh finding is on management participation, and the Minnesota statute requires that the AWARE program specify in writing how continued participation of management in the safety program will be measured, and the park board's AWARE program didn't include this element. The eighth finding is on disseminating program information. Similar to needing to know what state rules, regulations are out there to comply with them, employees need to know what internal policies are to be able to comply with them. We noted that a lot of staff, most staff, did not know where to independently find copies of safety policies. They would reference talking to another employee or to a supervisor to get that information. We also, from interviews, saw that most staff were not aware of what the comprehensive AWARE safety program document actually contained. It contains things like written roles and responsibilities, which most staff were not sure of where or whether their safety responsibilities were written down. There's a number of discussions of job hazard assessments, which again, most staff were not aware that these were in existence. We also noted that for the staff that did know where to find safety policies, some of them relied on hard copy binders, which would be in a supervisor's office, which is good, but we did not see any kind of process in place to systematically keep those binders up to date for policies and for safety data sheets on hazardous substances. And some of the binders had some out-of-date policies and procedures and some older safety data sheets that weren't being maintained up to date. Ninth finding is on safety training. Training is a way to control hazards that have been identified and assessed by providing information on the proper techniques to execute a task or the protective equipment that needs to be worn and how it needs to be worn, anything that requires informing an individual as to how to be safe goes through some sort of training. We noted that there were some park board-wide safety training requirements that were established for the entire organization, and there were some of the safety requirements that were established by the individual departments. The park board-wide safety requirements were based on job titles that were from 2010, and there's been a reorganization since then. So a lot of the titles on that designation of what role needs to have what trainings were no longer aligned with what is currently in place. For the department level training, the documents we saw for how training requirements were identified and how training requirements were tracked were very disparate. Seems like every department had their own approach to how they were doing things, which makes it difficult to track systematically and for management to know that their employees have received the training they need. This was also one of the objectives that was established in the safety program of, by the end of the year, having all employees receive their required training, but without having a more systematic approach to that, it would be difficult to really measure that objective. Finally, we did notice in the AWARE program that there was a systematic approach in the program to establishing department level training requirements, but it referenced that employees needed to receive the training that was identified in their job hazard analyses, which goes back to an earlier finding where these analyses were not current. And so that aspect of controlling how training needs were identified was not really in play either. Our last finding is on tracking staff concerns. A system to track staff concerns and suggestions, which is required by Minnesota rules to be set up by a safety committee, was not in place. The tracking of staff concerns provides a resource for identifying hazards that maybe have been missed, and also enables a two-way communication process, and is a requirement for the safety committee to put in place. And we did not see anything like that in the program. And those are our findings. Any questions?
Thank you. I see there's a lot of questions up here on the dais. I also want to note Councilmember Cano has joined us. Thank you. I especially want to point out that this is a pretty landmark report, not just because of the content of it, but because of the way this is the first time that our audit committee has gone and worked in collaboration with our Minneapolis Park Board. This is what we had in mind a couple years ago, and we made sure that when we restructured our audit committee that we included park commissioners on our audit committee. And I want to point out that Superintendent Miller has been a big help in mediating through this effort, and she's joined us here for this today. So with that, I can see there are a number of questions from the dais here. I have a number of questions of my own. So who would like to start? Mr. Fisher?
I can do that, Madam Chair. Thank you. I actually had a number of questions here with respect to the findings, but it all really boils down to a couple of things. It looks like a program that really didn't have any oversight responsibility, staff being unaware, some questionable compliance with laws and regulations, all are areas of concern. And while I recognize in the report that the Park and Recreation Board has apparently agreed and are implementing things, is there going to be some kind of effort to try to establish some kind of centralized responsibility to make sure that the things that you pointed out as possible areas of improvement actually get implemented?
Madam Chair, Committee Member Fisher, as part of our audit, we will be doing follow-up on the findings and recommendations, and I believe that they will include bringing on an individual to assist with the process, and that includes some distribution of roles and responsibilities within the park board. Safety should be part of everyone's job, in addition to having an individual that's a subject matter expert be able to assist with that. And I think the process of distributing some of those roles and responsibilities and establishing a safety committee for oversight will be helpful. I don't know if the park board may be doing any kind of additional internal processes to help establish that.
Mr. Vasiliev, it seems like Superintendent Miller. Superintendent Miller.
Thank you. I'm Jane Miller, Superintendent of the Park Board, and I feel like I'm the person responsible for probably answering that question. I would like to first state that we actually requested this audit, specifically because I was concerned about the status of the safety of our employees and what we were doing. And so this audit was very intentional on our part so that I understood exactly what the issues were and what the priorities of work that we needed to be doing. And so in addition to having this audit, we are also on the verge of issuing an RFP for a consultant. And the audit is a huge piece of the base of that RFP that we're issuing so that we can begin addressing the issues that are really fundamental to